Hello everyone, this is Brett Hancock, and so here I am. I'm going to do something a little different on this channel, at least for two videos. It might turn into a third video in this series, but I think just two, part one and part two. I want to talk a little bit about the history of our Bibles. So part one here, we'll just talk about history, and it's pretty much, it starts out with a little bit of a history of the Old Testament with respect to Christian history, and leading into New Testament history that affects our English Bibles primarily. But yeah, just give a little history. And then part two will have a lot to do with like Greek, Hebrew manuscript perspective, things that maybe some of you have heard, textual criticism, and what is a critical text, and what about, Greek, Hebrew manuscripts, and all those kind of questions that come up quite often. There's a whole lot of rumors and gossip out on the web, a lot of it being accurate, a lot of it inaccurate. And so anyway, so this is part one where we just talk about history, and we're not going to get into manuscript conversation, stuff like that. So here we go. Okay, so first thing is, it would be nice if the apostles just handed a set of manuscripts, both Old Testament, New Testament, to the church, and God miraculously just passed that down, and it was translated perfectly into all the languages that the people needed throughout time, throughout geography, around the world, and that they were just perfect one for one, and it's been preserved, and it would be nice if it was that simple. It's not exactly that simple. There's a little more history to that. So let's talk about it. Yeah, Christians have pretty much had to make great effort to preserve the scriptures. So where do we start? For this video here, like I said, this is a biblical history video. Next one will be more about manuscripts and things of that sort, as I said. So first we'll start with Old Testament history, pretty much just before Jesus arrived, and then we'll get into a little bit about the New Testament, as I said. So we'll start off with this. I'll probably use this slide also in the next presentation, just because I think this is important to understand what we have in our Bibles. And so transliteration versus translation, what's the difference? I mean, we hear a lot about translation, don't typically hear this term transliteration. So before we get in, read all these details, let's just get it clear. Simply, transliteration is about preserving the pronunciation. So we're getting ready to talk about the first translation ever of the Hebrew Old Testament, primarily Hebrew, just a little bit being Aramaic towards the end of the timeline for the time of the whole Old Testament, from the chronological start, Genesis chapter 1, all the way to the chronological end, where you get into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah for the Protestant Old Testament. And so yeah, transliteration, it's important to understand this, and where it's used. We'll talk a little bit about that. Translation is pretty simple. It's about preserving the meaning, right? So we're going from, let's say, Hebrew to the first translation we're going to talk about was Greek. So going from Hebrew to Greek, okay, picking Greek words that would match up well with the Hebrew words in the manuscripts that were translated. Transliteration, so let's get into the details. Again, preserve the pronunciation is the goal. This is used to preserve in the target language, so going from Hebrew to Greek, let's say, or from Hebrew to English, or from Greek to English, whatever the case may be, but in the target language, the pronunciation of each word from its original language. So original language we'll say is Hebrew, target language we'll say is Greek, because we're getting ready to talk about that for the first Hebrew Old Testament into the first Greek translation, a first translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. That was the first translation of the Hebrew Bible. So the target language is Greek, the original language is Hebrew. It's not a translation but using the target alphabet. This is key to understand. The words are written phonetically as they sound, so that they can merely or nearly be preserved as it was pronounced in the original language. So that's the goal. However, it was pronounced in the time of the transliteration with the limitations of the target alphabet. So Greek didn't have all the free reign ability to produce exactly the same sounds as Hebrew. So there's some limitations, but for the most part, that's what you're trying to do. And typically, names are transliterated, like Abraham, Jacob, Ezra, Enoch, Adam, whatever. So I say nearly because the target alphabet can have some limitations. I said that. Be able to recreate the same sound. Typical uses for names, I mentioned that. In the Hebrew Old Testament, all names in our English Bibles were written phonetically as they sound, right? Transliterated, right? To preserve how the translators pronounce them. So again, preserve the pronunciation. We talked about translation, preserve the meaning. Okay, translation and transliteration examples. Let's look at some examples of what I'm talking about. Okay, so first, transliteration. So again, transliteration, we are taking from one language into another language, and whatever that original language's pronunciation was at the time when this effort was done, we are there importing that into the target language. And of course, the examples we're looking at would look at the first translation of the Hebrew Bible. So Hebrew is the original language. We're taking it into Greek. So we're talking about the Septuagint. Again, Septuagint around 250, something like that, 280, 270 BC, 270 years before Christ came. Okay, so first example would be the Hebrew word Hebron. Okay, so there's no dogish here. Today, this Nikud, this system that was developed in the 8th, 9th century AD, so reflecting the current pronunciation, Hebron is how they would translate this, or transliterate this, or sorry, pronounce this, excuse me. And so, yeah, it would look something like this. Now, the way we have it in the Greek when it was transliterated is we're using the chi, epsilon, beta, rho, omega, nu. So Hebron. So this would reflect, since they got a beta, this would possibly reflect that there was more of a bait with a dogish kind of sound today, right? So it would be Hebron, right? But here's the thing. This is where I mentioned about, according to the limitations, right? Let's look at this. Things to keep in mind. Target language does its best to preserve the pronunciation at the time of the transliteration effort. I mentioned that already, which pronunciation systems tend to change over time, right? So at the time that effort was done, that's what's preserved. The target alphabet might have limitations to recreate exactly the sounds being imported into the target language, right? So this target alphabet has some limitations. So here, we don't have in Greek a way to make a v, like a V sound in English, a v. So if we wanted to actually do the way this is pronounced today, Hebron, this would be the closest we could get, Hebron, right? It's sort of like also, I didn't actually use David as an example, but when you're taking David from Hebrew and you want to bring it in, it's Dawid, because we don't have a way to make a V sound in Greek, at least at that time. Well, I should say, using my Erasmian pronunciation. But in modern Greek, they do take those upsilons that are basically like a U in our alphabet and pronounce it like a V. Like I would say euangelion, they would say evangelion, right? Which is where we get the word evangelist, right? So, so Hebron, that's what we end up with from this here, Hebron. And then another example, Melchizedek. This is from the Brenton Septuagint. This is the way it's spelled in there. And so this is the way it's spelled in the King James Bible. And so, yeah, Melchizedek. Melchizedek is the way that would be pronounced in using modern pronunciation in Hebrew. So it's pretty good. This is a short A sound, Melchizedek, but as we can see here, and of course reflecting the Greek, they had an E vowel rather than an alpha. So it's not Melchizedek, which is more something comparable to this, but it's Melchizedek. So I find that interesting. This is a patak, which is short A vowel, and yet they used an E vowel. So that's interesting. Anyway, I'll just point that out. Transliteration. Keep going with some transliterations here. So we got Avram in Hebrew, and it's kind of Avram. That's kind of how it's spelled. So that's what we have Avram here. But this is in the Greek. This is a rough breathing mark. So really, it'd be Habram. Habram is the way that would be trans or pronounced. Habram. At least with um, a raspy pronunciation, and even in archaic times, I'm not sure how far back. I know there's a restored pronunciation that they believe reflects the time of Jesus, how things were pronounced, and in there they don't have a distinction between rough and smooth breathing marks, and maybe that's the case. I don't know back then. Maybe you have to go further back before you actually had the rough breathing marks. But once you learn the morphology, the rough breathing marks just makes sense. I'm not going to go into that here, but anyway, all that to say that in modern pronunciation, Avram, Greek, this pronunciation, when there was rough breathing mark, would be pronounced Habram as opposed to Abram. Yeah, of course, today they pronounce it Abram, I'm sure. So Mamre in Hebrew, Mamre. Now, for some reason, I'm not sure this. I find this curious. When it was transliterated, brought into Greek, imported into Greek using transliteration, they end up with a beta in there, and I'm not quite sure why it'd be Mambre, Mambre, as opposed to Mamre. I was looking through the Hebrew Bible, what we have. There's no bait, this letter here, in any places I can see. I mean, I just glance at it. Spend a lot of time looking at it, but I just find that interesting. But in general, you get the idea. I mean, we're trying to protect what, and bring it in. So unless there's some scribal error somewhere that just got propagated off into future manuscripts, either on the Septuagint side or on the Hebrew side, like how this ended up happening, I don't know. Anyway, Eden, or Eden, is pretty much how we pronounce it, but Eden would be how it would be pronounced in modern Hebrew, Eden. And so some would have Edem, don't know why. Septuagint I looked at had Eden, but I see the Brenton translation, and maybe I think the Brenton is primarily relying on Codex Vaticanus, which we'll get into that kind of stuff in the next video, which is maybe like 4th century. So primarily, and then a little support from the Alexandrinus, Codex Alexandrinus, which goes into the next century, the 5th century. So 4th, 5th century, Vaticanus, and that. Maybe one or both of those had Edem rather than Eden. But yeah, so this is what we got in the Hebrew. This is what we have here. What it was like in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which obviously are much older than most of this Hebrew basis that I'm drawing from, is based on Aleppo Codex, a Masoretic tradition that's dated maybe 10th century AD, something like that. So, but anyway, my point is not about getting into that kind of stuff, but yeah, just to show, this is the process of transliteration to preserve the pronunciation, going from, Hebrew to Greek here and stuff. So Adam, this would be Adam. So Adam or Adam, and yeah, pretty much Adam. Yeah, Adam right here with the Greek letters. And then translation, we want to preserve the meaning. We want to get at the meaning. We want to carry the meaning over from Hebrew into Greek. Right? So now Elohim, for whatever reason, they didn't decide to transliterate that. They actually translated it. And so, yeah, in Greek Septuagint, we got Theos. And we follow the same tradition in the New Testament. Similarly here, we follow the same tradition in the New Testament that was established in the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which is Septuagint. So no pronunciation. In fact, the vowels that are used today, like this doesn't exist. You would never have a holam and then a kamans below it, but oftentimes you'll see it like that. Not always. Sometimes they'll just have a kamans, but a lot of times they'll put that just to remind us, hey, we don't pronounce this. We say Adonai, right? That's the way when I was in Israel. That's what I learned. That's the current tradition among Jews, religious or non-religious. They'll say Adonai. Whereas Christian tradition, somewhere along the way, people started coming up with vowels that we really don't have historical record to even know what they are. There is a paper from the channel Aleph and Beth, Aleph with Beth, Hebrew channel, which is an amazing channel. It definitely helped me through my Hebrew studies. That Andrew, Beth's husband, wrote, that I read a good part of it, at least the beginning page or so, and I need to go back and read it. But it is pretty compelling, the argument they're making, because they would actually pronounce this. I think they pronounce it Yahweh. As they wouldn't pronounce Yahweh, but yeah. So anyway, the Vav, most scholars agree, even in Israel, that historical, you go back far enough with biblical Hebrew, that was a wa type consonant, not a va, which is used today. So, and of course, we're not talking about pronouncing this word, but I'm just saying, just in general, when vav is used, which sometimes it can be used as a vowel, but when it's used as a consonant, it's a v sound, not a wa. So, but anyway, any of these sort of pronunciations, but it was translated. That's right. That's what we're talking about, right? We translated, just like Elohim translated as God, or Theos in Greek. This instead of instead of translating it or transliterating it, they translated it into the word that would mean Adonai, which Adonai means Kurios, which means Lord, right? So that's what we have in both the Greek Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. We take this name of God, and it becomes Lord. It becomes Adonai. This is Hebrew, Adonai, right? There is an actual Hebrew word Adonai. And so now you see both this and Adonai both translated in the Septuagint as Kurios, or in the New Testament as Kurios. You never see this transliterated. So I want to underscore that. I know there's some battles out there among different Christians arguing this kind of thing. And it shows you that since even in Israel, Israelis, Jews don't, it's not just a Christian tradition of the Septuagint, and there's people out there who say, Septuagint was created by Origin. It's like, no, that is so wrong and incorrect and just amateur, whatever. Even Jews know and admit that their first translation happened a few hundred years, they would say BCE. Christians would probably say BC, before Christ, but before the Common Era. So yeah, 2250 years ago, something like that, 2,250 years ago, something like that, when the translation took place, that this is what happened. They transliterated this into Kurios. Anyway, continuing on, Melech. So here we go. Here's Melech in Hebrew, and this is how it's spelled. And that's I'm just writing these so you can kind of see how you would pronounce the Hebrew in case you don't know Hebrew. But yeah, in the Bible, either in our English Bibles we've got King, or in the English Bibles we've got Lord, or in the English Bibles we've got God. But yeah, here the Greek for King is Basileos. So Melech was translated into Basileos, and then of course we bring that into our English Bibles as King, and so there you go. So what's the Bible's history? Let's start with the Old Testament, and as I'd mentioned, the first translation ever of the Hebrew Bible was the Greek translation. It was called by the early church the name, once Greek started transitioning into Latin, because keep in mind, in the time of Jesus, it was the Roman Empire. The Romans had conquered the Greeks, almost maybe, or at least the completion of the conquering of the Greeks was in that first century BC, right? So despite that, for hundreds of years, the language, the lingua franca, the common language of the people of the land of the Roman Empire, was still Greek, because you can't change a language overnight. Now, the language of the Romans is Latin, so it took a while for Latin to take effect. So once it did, then it started becoming known by this term Septuagint, that comes from Latin meaning 70, right? So, but in any case, even in Greek, when the early Christians referred to this translation, they would refer to it as the translation of the 70, or the 70 elders or 70 scribes. But it was actually 72, because there was, according to the letter of Aristeas, which is, dated about 200 BC. That's kind of a starting point document for this story that was passed down and talked about by a lot of early Christians the first few centuries, off into the future, of course. But yeah, that it was these 72 translators being involved in that work. Now, since Alexander the Great conquered the whole ancient world, this happened about around 300 BC, modern day Europe, Middle East, North Africa, western parts of Asia. So you could just imagine on the eastern side of the Atlantic Ocean, that all that land mass, so much of it, at least down as far as northern parts of Africa, and much of Asia was conquered by, or parts of Asia was conquered by Alexander the Great. All right. Much of that land, down to northern parts of Africa, was conquered by Alexander the Great. So Greek was the language that everyone in the Greek Empire, later became the Roman Empire, knew by the time Jesus arrived. So at the time of Jesus, it was the Roman Empire. Sure, there were also regional languages, whether it was Hebrew, Aramaic, all these different languages. Each people had, and we see that as Christians, we see that in Acts chapter 1. Chapter 1 and chapter 2, we see all this discussion of all these people that were devoted to to Judaism and observing Pentecost and that feast that was established for the Old Testament, which comes from Greek, Penteconta, or basically 50, so the 50 days after Passover. So we have all these people coming into that land, and you see all this discussion of the variety of languages that they were talking about, because, well, anyway, you could see it in Acts chapter 1. So there was lots of local languages, but the lingua franca, the common bond language that people had, was Greek. Pretty much like English is today, yeah. So continuing on with the history of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, this is Roman numeral 70 for the Septuagint, was the Old Testament Bible of the early church into the late 4th century. So somewhere as you're getting close to 400, Pope Damasus commissioned Jerome to go and translate the Old Testament and New Testament, both of them are Greek at the time, into a Latin Bible. This would become the Latin Vulgate. Jerome spent time with Jews, learning Hebrew in Israel, and became convinced by them that Septuagint was not as accurate as their Hebrew manuscripts. Keep in mind, the Jews rejected Jesus of Nazareth as their Messiah, having written some scathing comments about him that, recorded, going on back then, and then later on, they would show up in the 3rd, 4th century early record of the Talmud and the Mishnah. So now these are the same people that Jerome is actually believing. So formerly, early Christians contended with the Jews to show they had changed their scriptures in places for messianic prophecies about the Messiah that would show clearly that Jesus of Nazareth was that Messiah. And so they were changing some of their Hebrew scriptures, according to these early Christians, in some places to prevent Jews from converting. So Justin Martyr, we'll look at a few of his quotes. Tertullian, Origen around 240. There might be some others. So here's one from a writing called Dialogue with Trypho the Jew. This is primarily where we see this kind of stuff from the writings of Justin Martyr in this particular writing. So he says he's talking with this Jewish man, Trypho, trying to convert him to Christianity. But as far as I am, now this is chapter 71. So we're going to see chapter 71, 72, 73 discussions on this stuff. So, but I am far from putting reliance on your teachers who refuse to admit that the translation, you can translate that word as interpretation, but translation made by the 70 elders who were King Ptolemy of the Egyptians is the correct one, and they attempt to frame another. And I wish you to observe that they have altogether taken away many scriptures from the translations affected by these 70 elders who were with Ptolemy, and by which this very man who was crucified is proved to have been set forth expressly as God and as man and as being crucified and is dying. But since I am aware that this is denied by all of your nation, referring to the Jewish nation, Justin is saying, I do not address myself to these points, but I proceed to carry on my discussion by means of those passages which are still admitted by you. For you assent to those which I have brought before your attention, except that you contradict the statement, Behold, the virgin shall conceive. And I say it ought to be read, Behold, the young woman shall conceive. Or behold, you say that it ought to be read. So the Jews are saying this, but the Christians are saying this. So instead of young woman, the Christians are saying, no, virgin. So I promise to prove that the prophecy referred not as you had taught to Hezekiah, as being this baby that would be born, but to this Christ of mine. And now I shall go to that proof. So he shall move on to prove that further. And then Trypho responds, we ask you, first of all, before you do that, tell us some of your scriptures which you allege have been completely canceled. Okay, next chapter. I shall do as you please, from the statements then, which Esdras, so this is the Greek version, there's multiple books of Esdras in the Septuagint. There's only like one in the Protestant Bible, which comes from the Hebrew. So anyway, in Esdras, he's making mention of a particular, and I'm not sure which one this is. I was looking into it, trying to find it. I can't seem to find a version that we have today, but this is what he's referring to. He's saying that Esdras said to the people in this particular writing of Esdras, whichever one it is, the Passover is our Savior and our refuge. And if you have understood and your heart has taken it in, that we shall humble him on a standard, we, Jews, shall humble him on a standard, and thereafter hope in him. Then this place shall not be forsaken forever, says the God of hosts. But if you will not believe him, this is what Esdras is writing, and will not listen to his declaration, you shall be a laughingstock to the nations. Okay, so again, this is chapter 72 of that writing. Continuing in chapter 72, he goes on to say, from the sayings of Jeremiah, that have been cut out of the following. They've been cut out of the scriptures. I was like a lamb that is brought to the slaughter. They devised a device against me, saying, come, let us lay on the wood on his bread, and let us blot him out from the land of the living, and his name shall be no more remembered. So they're saying that Jeremiah 11:19. And since this passage from the sayings of Jeremiah is still written in some copies of the scriptures in the synagogue of the Jews, for it is only a short time since they were cut out. In other words, it hadn't been very long since they were cut out. And since from these words it is demonstrated that the Jews deliberated about the Christ himself to crucify and put him to death, he himself is both declared to be led as a sheep to the slaughter, as was predicted by Isaiah. He's talking about Isaiah 53, and is here represented as a harmless lamb, and being in a difficulty about them, they give themselves over to blasphemy. And again, from the sayings of the same Jeremiah, these have been cut out. This is no longer, we don't have this anymore. The Lord God remembered his dead people of Israel who lay in their graves, and he descended to preach to them his own salvation. Now, this is referred to in the New Testament. If you look at, I want to say it's 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, I think. I think that's where it is. Wait, I take that back. No. I'm sorry. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. Yeah, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. It makes mention of the Lord descending down to preach to the spirits in prison. That would seem to refer to the same passage that Justin is alleging existed in the scriptures before the Jews cut it out of Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah. And then chapter 73, I'll just mention this. This is just a little clip from that chapter. You can go read it more if you want. And from the 96th Psalm in the Hebrew Bible, in the English Bibles, unless you have the Septuagint, it would be 95th Psalm. They have taken away this short saying from the words of David, from the wood. So this portion here, which is this portion here. So that the Hebrew would read this way: tell among the nations the Lord has reigned. Whereas it says, according to Justin, tell among the nations the Lord has reigned from the wood or from the tree. Maybe it could be, I'm not sure if it's xulon would be tree or wood, but I'm not sure what the Greek actually says, but that's what he's saying. So anyway, I'll just give you that. Again, We'll talk a little more about Origen in a second. Tertullian, I know in this writing, he's talking a lot with the Jews, trying to convert them. Maybe around 200. Irenaeus may have talked about it as well. I'm not sure. There might be others. I'm not sure, but definitely we'll look at Origen in a second here. So yeah, but before we do, so again, nevertheless, Jerome, again, this is around 400. He was commissioned by Pope Damasus to take the Greek Old Testament, New Testament, and turn it into a Latin version that would later become the Latin Vulgate. So, nevertheless, Jerome bought into their arguments to the Jews for the reasons for obvious differences between the Old Hebrew Old Testament and Septuagint, and he just believed that it was the Septuagint that was corrupted rather than the other way around, where a couple hundred years before him, Christians believed that no, they apparently had evidence. So anyway, it's interesting. So the Hebrew became the Old Testament of the Latin Vulgate. The church originally was upset about this. Ironically, the Hebrew Masoretic Text Old Testament is the basis for most English Bibles today rather than the Septuagint. Unless, of course, you're in the Eastern Orthodox, then you would still have the Septuagint. But Septuagint Bibles are available today. There's the Brenton, there's the Nets, there's different ones. There's the Orthodox Study Bible, has the New King James New Testament, and the committee of them kind of put together a translation of the Septuagint in the Old Testament. So my favorite is actually the Nets Septuagint Old Testament. So in centuries prior, the church had tried to show that the Jews had changed some Hebrew messianic prophecies to make it look like Jesus was not their Messiah and expel some books that centuries later would be called the Apocrypha. Origen 240 created the hexapla from Greek, meaning sixfold, to prove that the Septuagint, the LXX Greek Old Testament, was reflecting the original Hebrew that was done 250, 280 BC, but by this point in time, 500 years later, about 500 years later, that there was some discrepancy, there was some disagreement, so differences between them. Most of the hexapla has long been lost. The 6 columns of the hexapla included the Hebrew Masoretic Text in one, the Segunda, translated Hebrew, transliterated. There you go. That's why you need to know that this was preserved the pronunciation of the Hebrew into the Greek, which is nice because Greek has vowels. And if anyone listening to this video knows Hebrew, you know what I'm talking about. The whole alphabet, the whole alphabet in Hebrew is just consonants. There's no vowels. So there's a much later, started around 7th, 8th century AD, when they started using the Nikud, is how you would say it in Hebrew. But basically the vowel pointings are the dots and dashes around the Hebrew letters to give it some pronunciation and stuff. So some of that doesn't exactly match up with the way things are pronounced when you're reading the Greek and the Greek Septuagint. So it's like, is that because of limitations of the Greek alphabet to not have captured that, or is it because of the traditions of the pronunciations? Which that's what I think, since I was in Israel for 2 years studying Greek and Hebrew and learning under native Israelis and hearing about the history of the pronunciations of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament of Hebrew, going back 3rd century AD kind of thing, and seeing some variations. So that would have been interesting if we still had that, the Secunda. And then the 3rd column would be Aquila, who was a a Greek proselyte into Judaism. Theodotion was another one. Both of them were Greeks that turned to be Jews, converted to Judaism. And so they each came up with using the Hebrew Masoretic that they had to a Greek translation. And then the Septuagint itself, and the text of Symmachus, the Ebionite. So that was one of the 6 columns of the 6-fold hexapla that Origen had put together. So today the hexapla is not extant, although there are some fragments here and there and different quotes from different early writers and so on. And I understand that there's some restoration project going on. I don't know how really successful that will be, or what the basis of what that effort will be based on. But anyway, so which is more accurate? So when we see in the Old Testament quotes from the New Testament, right? Quotes from the Old Testament, the New Testament, which is more, which lines up more? Do those quotes match up more to the Masoretic Text or the Septuagint? And from one source that I've seen, 50% of the time, they both match. But when they don't match, most of the time it matches the Septuagint over the Hebrew. So for the Hebrew Old Testament, we have prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s. So in other words, all the way up until that time, where what I'm about to tell you, this is all we had. So if you got a King James Bible or some, older translation that you're using, this is what you got for a Hebrew Old Testament. So we only had the Leningrad Codex, which is dated 10th century, and the Aleppo Codex. That's what we have for Hebrew up until the Dead Sea Scrolls. And still, the quotes of the whole Old Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls, we don't have everything. But it gave us a lot, and things that were dated all the way back to as early, some of the scrolls, and keep in mind all the scrolls. Well, I could say that a couple ways. Either none of the scrolls, I say it that way, none of the scrolls are complete, like they're fragmented. And sometimes it was like a jigsaw puzzle putting them together. But some very talented scholars out there that are able to do that kind of thing. So we've able to obtain a lot from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So yeah, dated some of the scrolls from 200 BC to about 50 AD is kind of where those, I've seen different numbers, 8 to 1,000 scrolls that we have kind of fall in that range. So some of the newer Bibles, some of them somewhat will consult the scrolls, which I think is a really wise thing to do. It's really good to consult that for Septuagint or for Old Testament. Yeah. So picking up where we left off with the discussion about the Latin Vulgate. Once the Latin Vulgate was the new Bible, starting around early 400s, 5th century AD, which early 400s of the church, based on the New Testament manuscripts and the Hebrew Old Testament of the Jews. This tradition stood until the 14th century. The Latin Vulgate was the Bible of the church until the 14th century, which is the 1300s. So John Wycliffe created the first English translation. There's controversy among scholars whether he was able to finish that, and it seems like some of his constituents were the ones that actually finished the work. But I think he was martyred for that. That was a big deal to the Catholic Church. They wanted everything locked up in the Septuagint, not in the Septuagint, in Latin. They wanted it in Latin, even though the people didn't speak and understand Latin. So, but the elites did, the scholar elites did, the priests knew Latin and so on, but the people didn't. So, making them completely dependent on whatever they told them. So the apparent reason was since the people spoke Old English, but the Catholics created the first English translation. The apparent reason was since people spoke Old English, but the Catholics spoke Latin in the Mass that they would have in church services, basically, and also the Latin Vulgate was in Latin. John Wycliffe wanted the people to have a Bible they could understand in their language, in the Middle English that they had, which is the language that they spoke. It's definitely much earlier version of English than we speak today. When I look at it, I don't understand it. So when I go back and look at English that far back, Wycliffe had help getting it finished. Like I said, his constituents there, his colleagues. The Wycliffe Bible became the first English Bible. So what manuscripts were used by Wycliffe's Bible? Exclusively the Latin Vulgate. Okay. So what is the Bible's history? Continuing on, the 16th century AD, Dutch scholar, so this would be in the 1500s, Dutch scholar named Desiderius Erasmus developed a Greek critical text for the New Testament that later would be known as the Textus Receptus. This is New Testament. This, together with the Old Testament sources like the Latin Vulgate, was translated into English by William Tyndale. So he took, the Latin Vulgate Old Testament and the Textus Receptus, the version that he had at the time, so it underwent a number of revisions. And the Catholic Church burned Tyndale. They were pretty upset about that, at the stake for this. Tyndale, like Wycliffe, only wanted people to have the Bible in their language, in the English at the time. So this few centuries later, right? So after this, uh, other English Bibles emerged, like the Matthew Bible, the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva Bible, and then eventually the King James 1611, which underwent a few revisions. So we'll get into some of that stuff as far as talk more about Textus Receptus and stuff in the next video where we start talking about manuscript related stuff. Later, the Latin Vulgate would be translated into English, late 16th, early 17th century. So it's 16th for the Old Testament, early 17th century for the New Testament, called the Douay-Rheims Bible. So so within a short period of time, end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century, this effort was done, Douay-Rheims Bible. This was kind of a reaction to the Catholics. They had everything in Latin, and it was Latin Vulgate, and then it got translated into English. So to get people back to Catholicism, part of the effort is what I understand, what I'm reading, I guess is what I understand. Part of that effort was taking the Latin Vulgate and putting it in English so they can get people back to using their Bible. So access to the Holy Scriptures, it kind of changed a little bit different idea here. I think this is important for people to keep in mind. Now, manuscript making stopped once the printing press came into effect. Now, some manuscripts still were made, I think, somewhere in the 16th century. I don't think much later than that. I think that's as far as it went. But the printing press was invented in the 1500s, which is the 16th century. Before that, the congregation of the laity of the Christians, except leaders in Judaism or Christianity, ever had a personal copy of the Holy Scriptures. So, the average person, Jew or Christian, like they didn't have until the advent of the or the invention of the printing press. So the Holy Scripture, except unless they were rich or something, it was possible for them if they were rich to get a copy of the Scriptures. But and if they knew people and they could get the Scriptures to be copied, it is possible. But so before you start panicking from learning about textual criticism, okay, so we're going to talk about in the next video, vast manuscript sources with some variations between them, thinking, I may not have every little jot and tittle of the Bible because of concerns about that. And what God has said since the beginning, relax, have an abundance of riches compared to your ancestors. God has allowed this for a reason. We should seek truth and be patient and contend with the history of our Bible maturely, I think, not panic and stuff. So anyway, I throw that in there. But keep in mind, like people never had personal copies of the Bible. We have a huge privilege to have that. And many people throughout history, as we get into the next video, and we talk about, manuscript variations throughout geography, throughout the whole timeline for the last 2,000 years, that a lot of people, like whatever they had was what they had. And if there was like a little variation here from this over in this area, they probably wouldn't even know about it. And it's like, this is their Bible and stuff or whatever. So what we have today is, as many textual scholars would say, like Dr. Daniel Wallace would say, we have an abundance of riches. So did the Bible writers put chapter and verse divisions in the Bible? I thought I'd mention this because a lot of times I think people really get hung up on chapter divisions and verse divisions and not really see that this is a recent innovation in our Bibles. So the answer is no. Okay, so where and when did they come? So chapter divisions, Archbishop Stephen Langton in the 13th century AD developed chapter division system used in our Bibles, right? So that's when we started having chapter divisions. And then a couple centuries later, we get Robert Stephanus, who was a printer and also very learned in Greek and Hebrew, and he did a lot of textual scholar kind of work and stuff. But anyway, with his printing of the Textus Receptus, which I think he did a couple of revisions on it himself that he inherited from Erasmus, he included verse divisions, and that was a new innovation, and it's been adopted even today. When I went to Israel, like Jews over the centuries have learned to conform to that, so that they can even have discussions with Christians and stuff about the Hebrew Bible. But that's what they would call it, the Hebrew Bible. The Old Testament basically is what we would call it. So there's a benefit. There is a benefit. There's also concerns there as well. I'm just going to mention what I was thinking of. Both can be helpful for us to follow along with each other. I'm sure that was the reason why they did it, so everybody could sync up and quote unquote get on the same page, right? But some of the detriments, some of the concerns that I have, every book we have except the Bible, chapter division means context change, right? So that's like just infused in our brain from our youth. When we're reading books, we see that when chapters change, the idea changes, the theme changes, the subject changes, the context changes, right? And so, since that chapter division thing has been injected in our Bibles, we tend to do that. Now, I think when we're reading narratives like the Gospels or Genesis or First, Second Chronicles, First, Second Kings, First, Second Samuel, books like that, it's not as much of a concern because you're reading, history. You're reading what's happening, and you can pick up changes, and the chapter doesn't really phase you so much, I don't think. But when you're reading epistles in the New Testament, Romans, all the way to the end of the Bible, like chapter divisions do make a big deal difference, because when you go from like chapter 1 of Romans to chapter 2, or chapter 2 to chapter 3, this is a big one. Chapter 2, like Paul says some very blatant things that most interpretations by many people, especially I'll say Protestants, of chapter 3 of Romans completely ignore what he just said in chapter 2. And that's why this is so important. There are no chapter divisions. It's artificial. It's something that was uninspired, and it's put in our Bibles. And let's use it carefully for what these uninspired people in the recent past did, so that we could all sync up, but not to think that when we go from chapter 2 of Romans to chapter 3 or any other letter, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, Philippians, Galatians, on and on, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, on and on, that, keep it in perspective. We go from one chapter to another. It's one continuous letter, and you should read it that way. In fact, if you use a site like BibleGateway.com, they actually have, you go click on the little cogwheel at the top where you can do some settings. You can check some check boxes so that it gives you shows you references or quotes in the Old Testament, where there's Old Testament quotes or whatever. It'll tell you where it's at. Things like that. Like if you click on the one that says remove chapter divisions or verse divisions, that's not a bad exercise to do. And then not only that, but even like type at the top of Bible Gateway where you want more than just chapter 1. Like you want you type in there like Romans, I'll just use Romans, picking on Romans chapter 1 to chapter 6, and you click it, and then you take away the chapter and verse division, start reading it and see if you don't maybe have a little different effect, having removed that invisible, where you think it's insignificant but it's not, like division there, whatever. You're just reading in context. You just keep reading from chapter 1 to chapter 2, and you don't even know, unless you haven't memorized it or whatever. You just keep, and now you're seeing the context, how the end of chapter 1 and what was said in chapter 2, bleeding off into chapter 3, how it's related, if you're paying attention, unless you've read it so much that you just have it ingrained in yourself and you're not allowing yourself to break out of that paradigm, and have a paradigm shift kind of thing, and just really listen to where you're crossing those borders, almost like from one country to another. When you're crossing those borders from one chapter to another, to see that's still talking about the same thing, and see the connection and the context and stuff. And so I'll just mention that. Yeah. So I'll mention this as well. 3 chapters in 3 chapters in 2 Peter, right? So if you go to the end of 2 Peter, what we would call chapter 3, what we would call verse 15 to verse 17, and just read in there, how Peter is saying, our dear brother Paul writes the same way in all of his letters. Very difficult to read, same way in all of his letters, and that many people twist what he says their own destruction. And I think this has contributed to this problem, where we have chapter divisions and stuff. So people really misunderstand. Peter is telling us, the Holy Spirit through Peter is telling us that Paul's letters, which is half the New Testament, it's 13 letters, is difficult. And he writes the same way in all his letters. He's difficult to understand, but nobody wants to get honest and admit that, well, maybe I'm misunderstanding. And I think this chapter division, verse division stuff contributes to the misunderstanding and stuff. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. So be careful with these chapter divisions. So yeah, we're finishing it up. Translations into English. These were some of the Bibles we mentioned that was for English translations that we have. Chapter divisions were introduced by Stephen Langton. Robert Stephanus introduced verse divisions. Yeah, that would have Stephen Langton. I think that would have been about 800 years ago, and then Robert Stephanus about 500 years ago. So yeah, so that's it. This is a really neat site here. You might want to check this out. I'll try to remember to put this link in the YouTube video description. It's basically comparing the Septuagint to the Masoretic Hebrew quotes in the New Testament. So I don't know. I don't know what translations he used. I don't think he was doing this based on Hebrew and Greek comparisons. I think it was based on English translations. So some of it, yeah, but it gives you an idea. So he's looking at quotes in the New Testament. This is Old Testament quotes he's saying, right? And this is the books from the Old Testament where you're finding them in the particular books in the New Testament. So that's kind of neat. Um, yeah, you get down here with the Hebrew, or sorry, with a lot of the prophets and stuff, and again where they're at in the New Testament. Um, so go down a little further. Some other interesting comparisons here. Here's where. Yeah, so here's the quotes we just saw. So 10% of the quotes in the New Testament come from Genesis, 20% come from Isaiah, 23% comes from Psalms. There's a whole lot of messianic prophecies from the Psalms, not just books like Isaiah and whatnot. I mean, from the whole Testament about the Messiah in the New Testament. So, and then this gets into agreement comparison between Septuagint and Old Testament. So here we've got the Masoretic Hebrew. Again, this is English translations versus Septuagint translations, and basically this particular chart here is showing that the quotes in the New Testament and the way they're translated are translated like the same um, for the Septuagint. And yeah, so like here's one that's significant. Isaiah 40 verse 3 to 5, all flesh shall see salvation of our God. I went and looked at the Hebrew, not just Hebrew translation. Yeah, they don't have the word for salvation, because the word for salvation in Hebrew is Yeshua, which we transliterate that to mean Jesus in the New Testament. So if what the early Christians, and I tend to believe that it is, that they did change some of the messianic prophecies, that would seem to point in that direction. So taking away the words Yeshua. So, and it's tough. Like, and when I say Yeshua, like variants of that root, that shortish in Hebrew is the word that means root. You get variants whether it's a verb or a noun or whatever. And so, they decided to actually make it the word salvation, the way they translated it, salvation of our God, rather than transliterating as Yeshua. But anyway, yeah, so you see here, like one here I would disagree with. Like here, the Sokoth, the way they pronounce this, you shall take up Sokoth, your king. Well, Melech in Hebrew, in the Greek, they they chose to translate it as Moloch. So apparently that was, and we see that in the books of Moses, right? That whatever king that was, like it was like using that word. And there's another one, Baal. Well, in Hebrew, that actually means husband, but that was used in the context where you could tell by the context this is a word that should be transliterated, because this is actually somebody what the apostate Israelites were referring, and of course it came from the Gentiles, but when they were going and worshiping that God, right? So Moloch comes the word Melech, it means king, yeah. So, and then Sakuth, they transliterated that word, but that comes from a word that means like tents or tabernacle. So here, the tent of Moloch, it's just a choice of translation or transliteration that makes it look like it's more different than what it is. Now, I didn't look this one up. I didn't take the time of your star god, whether Raphan, if Kaiwan, it doesn't ring a bell with me. So maybe this one is not as different from Acts chapter 7, 42, 43 as. And so I think the person that did this, which it's a nice site, I mean, it's just great work, that some of it maybe might just be based on the fact that they're comparing English translation rather than somebody actually having a knowledge of Hebrew and digging into the Hebrew and the Greek and actually seeing just how different they are. But at least it still gives you a good idea. So again, all those I just showed you, I'm going to show you the one that shows the Hebrew favorable, but here this is showing that the Septuagint is more favorable to match up with the quotes in the New Testament. We'll go down, look at another one. So this table here, I forget what this table is actually. You could take a look at it yourself. Yeah, it's got some good stats here. So here, yeah, he's got these charts here where the blue, he shows you down here, represents the Septuagint, and the purple, the Masoretic Text. So Old Testament book, so agreement Old Testament book versus the Hebrew. Yeah, actually, maybe I didn't really look at that. I'm not gonna even say. I think what I know what that is talking about, but I should have actually looked. Agreement of Old Testament books, Septuagint versus Hebrew. Yeah, showing how much they agree, I guess. Agreement by New Testament books, Septuagint versus Hebrew. There we go. So this would, in the blue, would say that in the New Testament, the quotes from the Old Testament, the blue is favoring the Septuagint, purple is Masoretic. So you see, most of the time it's the Septuagint. 2 Timothy. So here, Septuagint over here, this doesn't really match, and the Masoretic matches a little bit better the Hebrew, or sorry, the quotes in the New Testament. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Out of Egypt I have called his children. So the Septuagint, this is where the Septuagint is kind of falling short. There's not as many in this chart as we had up top. We had a lot more when we were saying the Septuagint was more favorable in matching up with the New Testament quotes of the Old Testament, right? But in this particular chart, this is saying, well, for these verses, the Hebrew kind of matches better. So, but it's just not as much. So the Septuagint is the predominant winner, pretty much by a landslide, for matching up with quotes in the New Testament from the Old Testament. So here's some others. This is where they kind of are like both matching up pretty well. So you can look at that. But anyway, yeah, I'll try to put this in the... yeah, this is a really interesting page. I want to go back and read this some more. I just discovered it, and so I just thought I would let you know about it. Yeah, it looks like a little bit of a long... yeah, okay. I guess you do. So yeah, I'll put this in the description and stuff. So yeah, that's it. Okay, God bless. We'll get into part 2 very soon with the a look at textual criticism as a discipline, its purpose, manuscript variations, Hebrew, predominantly New Testament related stuff, but we'll look at some of that stuff. So that'll be part 2. That'll be coming up soon.